Hi, this is Paul. Sam Harris was on Ben Shapiro's Sunday show. I've grown to really enjoy Ben Shapiro's Sunday show. He has some interesting guests on it. Of course, Jordan Peterson was on the first one, and I commented on that. But this was an interesting interview, and obviously more interesting when they decided, at least for me, when they decided to talk about religion. So here's a little bit of it.
Where you think morality comes from. So in the religious view, obviously, there are certain things that I believe are capable of understanding by any sentient human being. So I don't believe that all human beings in the absence of religion are immoral people who go around murdering their neighbors and raping their sisters. I think and in fact, this is pretty well embedded in even Judaic philosophy, the idea that there is a sort of natural law theology where you as just a normal person know not to kill people and know not to steal and know to set up courts of law. This is what they call the seven commandments to Noah. But the idea is that anyone can basically discover these things. And there are universals across culture about you're not supposed to murder your brother. But the biblical reading is that to reach a more sophisticated level of morality that leads to a sort of right-based society we see here, you at least need the catalyzing enzyme of a Judeo-Christian religion in order to get here. That would, I think, be the most rationalistic argument on behalf of Judeo-Christian values.
But where is here again?
Here would be a civilization that values individual rights above the values of the collective, that says that people are to be treated, to use the biblical phrase, as made in the image of God, that we should treat individuals as made in the image of God. That does not happen in the absence of a Judeo-Christian value system. That's the religious argument. Although that is more of a historical argument. Right. That's what I'm saying. It's a rationalistic argument, because the deeply religious argument would be God said so, so do it. Right. But that's not the argument that.
Okay, right there. The deeply religious argument is that God tells us to do it. There we go. I want to talk about that, because that is usually how the frame is set up. And it goes like this. Well, especially for Sam Harris, there's a make-believe story. There's an old man in the sky, and this old man is something like a European despot or Donald Trump. They have ideas about what they want the world to be, and they're a bit slow on the trigger with things, but for the most part, if you cross them, they'll make you pay. So is Ben Shapiro right? Now, he would resist this characterization, as would I. I don't think that's what God is. I don't think that's what Ben Shapiro thinks God is. But when I listen to Sam Harris and some of the other celebrity atheists, that kind of sounds like what they say God is. And then you wind up this back and forth. Yes, he is. No, he isn't. Now, Ben Shapiro will go on to argue that God's will is built into natural law, and if you follow natural law, things will go better with you or for you than if you resist it. And as Ben Shapiro said, there's this covenant of Noah, which everyone should be able to appeal to, and the atheists aren't that far from it either, because they say, well, there's these, at least part of the Ten Commandments they could agree with, and so on that conversation goes. Well, where this usually boils down is that the difference between religious and irreligious people is the difference between rebellious people and God's people, and that God's people obey God. And the assumption is that God's people will be rewarded for their obedience, that religious people will eventually be punished for their disobedience, and it's God's mercy that makes him wait for the religious people to maybe hopefully see the light. Now, I refer to this as common religion. This is not too different from karma. It is not too different from the basic assumptions of many religions and religious people and religious cultures. You can find ideas for it in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. I haven't read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but just about every religion will either posit do right and you'll be blessed in this life. If the religion has an afterlife, do right and you'll be blessed in this life. And if not in this life, then you'll be greatly rewarded in the afterlife. Now, you can find those arguments made in the Bible. But what's important is that these aren't the only arguments the Bible makes, that this position, I would assert, is nested within some other positions, and that, in fact, this is one low-resolution take on religion which doesn't fully describe, especially all of Christianity, but this is a take on Christianity that you will find many, many Christians have. And, in fact, I think many, many Christians wrongly assert that this is the ultimate take on Christianity. that, and I've mentioned this in other videos, what the Bible is fundamentally is a list of rules, basic instructions before leaving earth. If you comply with the rules, God will bless you. If you violate the rules, God will curse you, and that reduces life down to this kind of drama, and that therefore sets up the drama that God is a man in the sky who's got particular ideas about how we would live, and if we follow those rules, we'll be blessed, and if we disobey those rules, we won't. But here's the problem with religious pluralism. Not all religions really necessarily agree on all the little rules. And this is where Sam Harris will really come into his own with the argument, because, well, this religion over here has these little rules, and you can find rules in the Bible that people of good sense, even religious people, no longer follow. So, you can get into questions of, within Judaism, of what is the law and how the law is supposed to be applied, especially as cultures and technological contexts change. Christians, of course, in a certain way modulate the Old Testament law with the New Testament, and that even differs between different tribes of Christian religions, and that, quite frankly, and I think the atheists have a great point with this, is often inconsistently replied. For example, a Christian would say, well, I have no problem wearing a shirt that has cotton and nylon woven into it, and I love lobsters. I love to eat them. That's against the Mosaic law. So why do I eat lobsters when it's against the Mosaic law? Then you have all these convoluted religious answers, and the religions, the various different tribes within religions, much less the tribes between religions, can't agree on the law. So therefore, God is an unworkable framework that it makes no point to try and continue with this process. And then you get to the great problem. Now, a friend of mine named Matt had a Patreon, one of the last straggler Patreon conversations with Jordan Peterson, and he's got a video of it, and he has Peterson's permission to use it. And Matt and I have been talking for a while, and this video might come out. But it was a very interesting conversation that Matt and Jordan Peterson had together. And towards the end of it, they got into some very real. Matt has a seminary education. He's currently teaching math. He's about to get married. I did a little video with Matt, and we might put that video ahead of the Jordan Peterson video because I thought it might be helpful for Matt to explain himself a little bit more, because the Jordan Peterson Patreon conversation goes fast. Matt's also thinking about setting up his own channel, so he's currently trying to figure out what he wants to do with this video. But it's an extremely interesting conversation with Jordan Peterson, and like I said, Jordan Peterson gave permission for him to use the video, so don't worry about that. Well, I was very interested when I listened to the video, because where this video came down to towards the end was the great problem. Well, what is the great problem? Well, the great problem that you will find Calvinism wrestling with, and Lutheranism wrestling with, and Methodism wrestling with, and Christianity wrestling with, and Islam wrestling with, to a degree. I don't know Islam nearly as well. Judaism wrestling with is, finally, do we save ourselves through some moral effort, through some obedience to the law? As in a sense, Ben Shapiro says, well, we're given the law, so religious people obey the law and they are blessed by it. Well, that fundamentally puts us in the driver's seat and us in the decider's seat. And for those of you who often comment on my Calvinism, well, this is exactly where Calvinism gets interesting, because, well, Calvinism, let's imagine a spectrum, and let's imagine on this spectrum, way over on one side, there's a religious group that says, well, if you really want to be saved, you have to go door to door and preach our religion, or you have to become a monk, or you have to become, I remember two-speed religion, or you have to become a religious superstar, or you have to fast regularly. In order to earn God's favor, you have to do all of these things. Now, again, there's the problem of, well, which God and which revelation and all of that stuff. But in order to earn God's favor, you have to earn your way into heaven. Well, Protestantism comes along and says, nope, that's not right. You can't earn your way into heaven. But that then poses a problem. Well, then how do we know who makes the cut and who doesn't? Well, some solve that by saying, well, it's universalist. Everybody makes the cut. And then Rob Bell comes along and says, well, everybody makes it eventually, and there's a variety of other universalists out there. Christian universalism is a pretty handy thing because it just eliminates the problem of everlasting divine punishment and the difficulties that sets up. C.S. Lewis addresses the problem in other ways in his book, The Great Divorce. I'm not going to go into all of those problems, but the great problem, the great conflict here, which is where Peterson goes with my friend, is but finally, is it on our side or is it on God's side of the line in terms of our rescue, our salvation? Well, our salvation from what? Our salvation from everything. Is Christianity merely hell avoidance? This is something I've been talking about for years, because sometimes when I listen to Christians, you would get the idea that Christianity is basically about going to heaven and not hell when you die, and so you live a Christian life to do this. But as I mentioned before, this gets really squirrely. If you go to an evangelist crusade, you're sitting there and you're listening, and they're just saying, all you have to do is accept Jesus. So then you walk down the aisle and say, I accept Jesus, and it's like, I'm in. And they say, okay, but now you have to go to church. What? What do you mean I got to go to church? You said all I had to do was accept. I accept. Now leave me alone and let me do what I want because I got my card punched. And then even all these Protestant people are like, oh, no, that's not it. You're going to have to do these things. And so this issue is engaged, and you'll find it in churches all over the place. And you'll find it haunting anyone who has an idea of hell and an expectation of divine judgment, even without hell. But at least, God's going to give super Christians better places and lesser Christians worse places. Anybody with that kind of living attitude deals with this anxiety. Have I done enough? Well, you're saying, well, this is based on me doing enough. And there are many, 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 many ways in which religious communities, including my own, try to navigate this question and try to resolve it. And these questions, as you know, with Calvinism, because most of you know about this much about Calvinism, and so your Calvinism, determinism, predestination, and, well, how can you believe that? Well, if that's about all you know about Calvinism, then Calvinism gets reduced to determinism or divine election or the 5 points of Calvinism from the canons of Dort, etc., etc. So there we are, all in this mess. And what's interesting about this conversation with Peterson is that he and this young Christian man who's got a very interesting story go back and forth, and Peterson finally gets to that point and basically says, what you kind of asking the guy, answer this for me. And can we really answer this? If we know the answer, can we put it in words? Is the answer actually more lived than articulated? If you listen to my conversation with Nathan, in a sense, here's a little factoid for you. If you read the New Testament again and again, you find verses that says, Jesus returns to judge the living and the dead, and on what basis does he do so? Based on what we do. Well, wait a minute, I thought if I just accepted. Are you saying I have to qualify for this? How do we get there? What does that mean? Why would, on one hand, all of you Protestants say, no, you just have to accept and believe? Like Paul says, if you believe with your heart, I guess he's using biblical anatomy. Not modern anatomy. If you believe with your heart and if you profess with your lips, then you are saved. And, some people then accuse me, because when people say that to me, I usually start picking at them and saying, well, what do you mean by this word? And what do you mean by this word? And then in this Jordan Peterson conversation, people would say, yeah, that's what you people do. You don't make it simple. Well, Paul made it simple, and I think Paul is very right. But what does it mean? What does it mean in terms of our lives? Well, then Paul, in talking with the Corinthians, declares some things, some expectations on their behavior, and tells them that they should cut out their communal meal because it's doing more harm than good, this communal meal that has come to be the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or Christian communion. So, yeah, I'm not going to simplify it, but I'm going to talk about it because I don't know that the question is unknowable, and I suspect that the question is best answered by one's life, and I think actually that's what the Heidelberg Catechism says, but we'll talk about the Heidelberg Catechism a little bit later on. Does God save us or do we save ourselves? So you say you're a Calvinist, so that does put me way over on the end of God's work instead of our capacity to save ourselves. In fact, the great Calvinism-Arminian debate was very much over this issue. If we're not capable of doing right, is God just punishing us for doing wrong? And how can that be reasonable or just? Because if we don't have the capacity to comply with God's law, then it isn't reasonable or just for him to hold it against us. It's a powerful argument. What does Jesus mean by "it is finished" on the cross? Pause and have a drink of water. Now, this Sunday, this isn't exactly a rough draft for Sunday because my thinking is still way too not quite well enough put together, but I am thinking a lot about the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. And if you don't know your Bible, there were two kingdoms, the northern and the southern kingdom. After Solomon, the kingdom split between Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and the northern kingdom was, for the most part, larger and more powerful than the southern kingdom. But the northern kingdom had far more troubles with assimilating the religion of its neighbors, and this is shown in the Book of Kings and in the Book of Chronicles. In the Book of Kings, the Book of Kings communicates this, as the Old Testament does, in these little episodes, and all cultures communicate in their own ways. And the Hebrew scribes, as I've said before, these guys were geniuses. The way they could bring all of this history and distill it down and say it in a different way. And for many years, a lot of people thought that these guys weren't very good at what they do, but through the work of the likes of Robert Alter, here's his stuff. If you're looking for, he's a Jewish scholar, actually. He's not a Christian scholar. He taught for years at Berkeley. Robert Alter, The Art of Biblical Narrative, The Art of Biblical Poetry. The better we learn to read the text, the more amazed we are at the artistry of the text. And so in my sermons, I'm down to 2 Kings 17 and the fall of the northern kingdom. And so what happens is that the Assyrian Empire decides that it's been raiding these little kingdoms and basically running up to them and saying, give us all your gold, or I'm going to burn your city and rape your women and kill your men and take the women and children as slaves. But then we'll go back to our own country because Assyria had plenty of its own internal troubles and troubles with other more powerful kingdoms. The region where Israel and Judah was always kind of the middle ground between Egypt and the powerful nations of the Fertile Crescent. And so they were good for raiding, they were a highway, and the strength that Israel enjoyed during David and Solomon was at a time when both Egypt and the Mesopotamian empires and civilizations were quite weak. But at this point, Assyria has decided to have a change of policy. Now it wants to establish an empire. And so it brings its armies down to conquer, not just to extract gold and wealth and slaves. And so they come down to conquer, and they intend on turning this whole region into districts or provinces of Assyria. And you can see here some of the provinces that the Assyrian Empire laid out. What they did, however, after they destroyed Samaria and the northern kingdom, was a strategy of assimilation. Now, one of the interesting things that you see in the Bible are that the different ancient empires had different strategies of assimilation. And my video seems to have frozen. Oh, now I'm unfrozen. We'll see if it freezes in the recording or if it just happens there. But the different empires had different strategies of assimilation, and the Assyrian strategy of assimilation was fairly simple. You come down, you take the people out of their old land, and you bring them to another land, and you take the people from the other conquered peoples that you have, and you mix them up with the other people, and you bring them back. And you install them then in Israel. So you take the Samaritans out of Samaria, and then you take people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire and you put them in their homes. Now, why is this a smart strategy? Because what it does is it cuts off people's ability to leverage their familial connection, their ancestral ties to the land, all of their history, and you cut them off and then you mix them up, and they won't be anywhere near as able to organize and assimilate. Let's imagine that if the United States had conquered Iraq And let's say the United States has decided to conquer Iraq and North Korea at the same time. So it would take people from Iraq and move them over to North Korea, and take elements of North Korea, usually the elite and the army, and let's say move them into Iraq. Now, how would that go? Well, it would be a pretty smart strategy by the United States, because what happened after the U.S. conquered Iraq was, well, people reverted to all of their religious tribes and their clans, and you had the militias form, and it was bedlam. Now you haul them off to North Korea, and let's say, well, let's have South Korea manage North Korea, and so they've got a bunch of Iraqis there, and well, it'll be a problem for a generation or so, but these ancient empires were both brutal and effective, and so maybe for a generation or so you're going to have trouble, but if you repress them thoroughly and have, a well-stocked network of secret police and don't let them give arms, within a generation or two, the wealth and affluence of South Korea will probably win out, and I don't know what the North Koreans are going to do in the middle of the Middle East, because that area of the world is plenty turbulent as it is. But this is what the Assyrians do. And now this, as we're going to see, this sets up a lot of interesting situations. And if you read the book of 2 Kings 17, it's just a little brief description of the fall of Samaria and the last bad Israelite king. And then there was a sermon. And the basic heart of the sermon is Israel sinned. They worshipped other gods. They practiced child sacrifice. I spoke about that in my rough draft for Sunday last week and in my sermon on my church channel. They did child sacrifice. They worshipped Baal. They worshipped Asherah. They had high places. They didn't observe the law or the covenant of the Lord that they were supposed to. They did wicked things that made God angry, and they didn't heed the warning of the prophets. And so therefore, God let the Assyrians come in and destroyed them. Now, this seems to go along well with Ben Shapiro's version that deeply religious argument is that God tells us what to do. Now, I don't mean to cast Ben Shapiro in an unkind light here. I'm sure if Ben Shapiro and I sat down and had a conversation about this, it could probably be quite an interesting conversation, because the Jews have had plenty of time to nuance these kinds of arguments, and he's giving us a low-resolution summary of what is basically common religion. Deeply religious argument. This is from above, and I'm still talking about from above and below, because that's very much what's going on with the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversations. The deeply religious argument is that God tells us what to do, and then the assumption behind that is that then we do it. And the assumption after that is that if we do it, God will bless us. And it's certainly true with natural law. There was when my homeless friend was living outside my door, and I'd run him to the emergency room on a fairly regular basis. One day he asked me, he says, Paul, why is it always you driving me to the emergency room and not me driving you to the emergency room? And I said, well, let's think about this a moment. Number one, you don't have a car. Number two, you don't have a car because you are pretty much, you've given yourself over to your alcohol and your drugs, and you're fully aware of your mental illness issues, because you used to work in the area of mental illness, and you're fully aware of the medications you should be on, and you have, by your own admission, decided to live your life this way. And you eat out of the dumpster of the grocery store next door, and you sleep outside, and if, like the one time you found a bag with some little bags in it and a needle, and you thought, oh, this must be heroin. So you decided to shoot it up your arm. And when you shot it up your arm, what you discovered that, no, it was just a bunch of dirt made to look like heroin. And then you had a horrible infection in your arm, and so I drove you to the emergency room so they could clean up your arm, because otherwise you just injected a whole bunch of crap into it. So is it really a mystery about why it's always me driving you to the emergency room and not the other way around? Natural law is a thing. And if you decide to abuse your body, you will probably not have a good time with your body. And if you decide to live in disorderly life, there are consequences to what we do. And we can appreciate these consequences, and we can predict these consequences. And you don't necessarily have to be a religious person to understand that. Now, obviously, religious people go another step further and say, there's a God up above who is watching over things and exerting a degree of control, and if you please this God, he is going to bring good things to you. That's, again, common religion. But now when we hear this story and we read 2 Corinthians 17, especially in our cultural context, maybe this is dating me a little bit, but I think it plays pretty well now too. We kind of imagine this as children of the 60s, or maybe children of the 80s, or maybe children of the aughts, trying to get away from a repressive, angry, religious father. The father has archaic or capricious rules about what is right or wrong, and they don't really bear any, they're not the natural law type of rules of eat your vegetables and exercise and then you'll be healthy. They're more the irrational religious story type rules from these ancient books, and ideas about sex, or ideas about going to church, or ideas about whatever archaic thing these ancient books drag out. The kids just want freedom to explore the truth and make life work for themselves. And so that's how we can understand Israel, that this ancient God, the Lord is, he's awfully strict. And why doesn't he just get a clue and be happy being one God among many, and let the polytheistic strategy that I've spoken about in some of my previous videos, let the polytheistic strategy work to manage religious pluralism and, go light on that circumcision business, because after all, who on earth wants to do circumcision back in the day without anesthesia or antibiotics? So no one God can have all the truth anyway, so it's only reasonable for someone, if there's no option to be a secular person or not to believe in any gods, because that simply wasn't thought about, to at least work the gods as best you can and pick the God that works for you and find whatever practices work for you. Now, this isn't really any different from what most Americans do. We are consumers, and we are consumers religiously, and so we decide to pick whatever God suits us. Now, again, Ben Shapiro, we come into that and say that's not really a way to go. And actually, that was quite interesting in my conversation yesterday with Nathan, how Nathan described his own story about being spiritual but not religious, and he realized that if he actually wanted to make progress with himself, he needed something outside of himself to be accountable to, and that's actually what many religions do, is they structure you and they discipline you and they help you begin to make progress in a straight line. But it's very easy, and I've seen, I think many people, if they'd pick up the book of Kings and they'd read this little sermon in 2 Kings 17, they would say, yeah, this is that religious God. And I mean, if I slid this document before Sam Harris and say, Sam, what do you think of this? I think this is very much the story he would tell me. But is there anything unusual here? To Assyria, Samaria, the capital of Israel, is no different from Gath or Ashdod or Gaza or any of the other places they conquered. Probably when they got to Israel, they realized, here's yet another polytheistic people working on a local version of a religion, of a regional fertility cult. Baal, you had Baal in all these different places, to be assimilated so that the empire can colonize the natural resources of the people in the land. People are people, so let's get the people out of here. Let's cut them off, and this is the key thing. And this is really what let's work in ways to cut them off from their story. And in fact, if you want to help an alcoholic become sober to one degree enough, you change their story. If you want to assimilate someone into a prison system, you take away their clothing and you change their story. If you want to, in World War II, take the Jews and massacre them, you take away their property. You take them to a new place. You cut off their story. It's interesting that even adoption, I mean, especially the way it was practiced up until just not too many years ago, you cut people off from their story. And if you cut someone off from their story, you can, in a sense, especially if you do it young enough, it seems that you can somehow make them anew. Now, a lot of the very interesting tests with identical twins suggest that there's more that's built into us than we can imagine. When you look at people, identical twins separated at birth, and they marry women of the same name, and they drive the same cars, and they have the same jobs. Those kind of things are fun. But generally speaking, the Assyrian strategy is a pretty good one, and so they come to Israel, and here's just another kingdom. Yeah, they got their God, but they've got lots of gods, and they're pretty much just like everyone else. So if you strip away the flags and the pretense of being special, Everyone is simply keeping step with the times. It's the 21st year of King Ahaz, after all. This is morality by calendar, and if you listen for it, you'll hear it all the time. They wouldn't say it's 712 BC after all, because of course they're not telling time that way. But religious and political consumerism, or in my best interestism, is pretty ubiquitous. This is what we do. But now I wanted to ask a question. This is what I've been thinking about. I've been working on my sermon. When did Israel stop being Israel? Did it really happen with the fall of Samaria? I think what the book of Kings has been saying all along was that Israel stopped being in Israel a long, long time ago, and it had everything to do with the Baals and their behavior and all of those things that 2 Kings 17 had been talking about. Israel stopped being Israel long before Assyria took away its people. The people could be Israelite or subjects of Assyria or anything else. It didn't matter once they were divorced from their stories. Sure, they might have had some individual stories and cultures, but within a couple of generations, that would be all gone. One of the things that we don't like to think about is that how much do you actually know about the generation beyond your grandparents or your great-grandparents? You know very, very little. Do you practice their religion? Your religion has probably changed considerably. Every time I hear Sam Harris talk about these dogmas and how religions don't change, I think, you don't know anything about religion, because I watch religions change all the time. And you say, well, you're a Protestant. Protestants are used to changing. And that's true. The Orthodox and the Roman Catholics haven't changed as much, but almost every religion has a spectrum. You can find this in Judaism. You can find this in Islam. You can find it in many, many other religions, that religions are, in fact, always changing one way or another. And often the changes are unconscious, and the people themselves don't really know quite how much they are changing along with everything else. So when Israel gets destroyed, what would be gone? Well, it's their identity and the story it is built upon. And again, if you look at my conversation with Nathan, and he and I talked quite a bit about this, about the idea that I have of, well, what are we? We are a story. We are a story more than anything else. Now, someone sent me a note on Twitter after listening to the conversation and said, have you resolved this stuff about the resurrection? And I think they mentioned embodiment and said, yeah, that's why in Christianity, and Jordan Peterson has brought this up, it's a pretty amazing thing that unlike many religions, Christianity imagines our re-embodiment. Well, what is that? Knowing now what we know about science, it's kind of like, well, of course I can't be me without a body. I need a body. And it may very well look, especially if you consider the resurrection of Jesus, and if you believe that was a historical, physical event, it may very well be that my Paul Vanderklay 2.0, the resurrected, perfected Paul Vanderklay 2.0 in the resurrection, you'll look at me and you'll kind of recognize me, but it'll also be kind of hard to recognize me, because that's what we see with Jesus going on, and it's really hard to know what's going on in those stories. But I'll be like me and not like me. Now, it's very interesting that my grandmother had an idea, which I, even as a young seminary student, kept trying to debunk for her. She had an idea that after she passed, she wouldn't recognize my grandfather, and this gave her quite a bit of trouble. And I said, I didn't say Lord, I did talk to God about it, but I also talked to my grandmother about it. I said, Grandma, I really don't think God is going to play tricks like that in the age to come. That, your relationship with Grandpa might very well be different than it was in this age, but you'll recognize him, you'll see him, because that would be a rather cruel thing if we had to just try and find all those people to question, are you my grandma? Are you my grandma? And if you read that little book that I read on, I said, no, I'm a snort. P.D. Eastman, was that who made that book? It was bound with all my Dr. Seuss books that I loved as a kid. Anyway, I digress. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, the resurrection. The me that I believe God will reincarnate somehow, although that's not exactly the right word, because that'll get a whole bunch of other people excited about something I'm not trying to say. The me that God will resurrect, yeah, it'll be me. It'll be the perfected me. It'll be it will be a me I can't fully know or appreciate right now, because as I mentioned to Nathan, if I even just ask myself, well, what me can I know? Then let's say I have a list of everything I know about myself, and I compare it with everything that my wife knows about me, and there'll be some conflicts in there. That's what happens in marriage. And there'll be the me that all my kids know, because my kids see me in a different way than my wife sees. And there'll be the me that the people of my church see. And there'll be the me that the people I worked with in the Dominican Republic see. And there'll be the me that the children that I knew growing up. I went to Christian school, went K through 12, pretty much with the same 100 people all the way through. And then there'll be the me that my doctor knows and sees. I mean, there's just so many aspects of me that it really takes a God to actually allow there to be a me, or a knowable me, in all of its manifestations and all of its realities. So, and therefore only that type of being could actually resurrect me into the me I could be. And we really have very little idea about what process looks like in the age to come. And I love C.S. Lewis's stories, and he plays around with that a little bit, but we really don't know. Anyway, Israel. What is Israel? When Assyria came and knocked it over, I would assert, and I think the book of Kings is asserting, Israel was already gone. That's the point of the story. That's the point of the way the book of Kings keeps telling the story, that Israel, bit by bit by bit, in corruption is vanishing. And we talk about this Greek ship that, kept getting replaced, and is it the same ship? Well, your car, if you live, I live in lovely California, where rust does not consume our cars, but I live plenty in Michigan where rust does consume your cars. And is the car that the rust is eating the same car that came off the assembly line? Israel was rusting away. Israel was corrupting away. And the entire book of Kings is the story about the corruption of Israel. And we see this happening. We see it happen with governments. We see it happen with people. We see it happen with institutions. Jordan Peterson talks about corruption all the time. So by the time Assyria gets there, I think the part of the argument to the book of Kings is Israel's already gone. Israel's already dead. Well, then you have the question, well, what is Israel? What establishes that identity? Well, it's a story. But it's not merely a story, because the story is tied, obviously, to physical history, and it's tied to the relation verse, and it's tied to all of the different aspects that reality is. And again, I should really do a video, continue to work on videos on reality, because as you could hear, and again in my conversation with Nathan yesterday, this is something that I'm continually thinking about now, and how if we have reality on a spectrum as such, highest reality is real on more layers. Something that is real on more layers is more real than things that are just on a few layers. And layers isn't the right word. Aspects, we don't really have language for this, because this is terribly difficult. And my friend who keeps writing me about Heidegger, I got your email. I hadn't heard from you for a while. I was getting worried. But I got your email, just haven't had time. I usually try and do email in the afternoon. Otherwise, if I start writing emails, I never get anything else done. So, yeah, that's right now my working draft of reality, and kind of incorporating a lot of Peterson, which is why that which we act out is often more real than ideas. Now, it isn't linear like that, and it can be out of proportion in ways, and I can think about way more things than I can articulate, and I can think about and articulate way more things than I can act out. And that is part about me being a creature bound in time and space. But as a preacher, that's often true too. I can talk about goodness much better than I can be good. And so, in Jordan Peterson, for example, I'm into the audiobooks of Maps of Meaning. The introductory chapter I found fascinating. But the goodness that I can articulate, obviously, when Peterson is working on getting his speech right, I mean, that's part of the process to getting your life right. And actually, the book of Proverbs talks quite a bit about this, where words are many, sin is present, basically, the book of Proverbs says. And woe to me who talks. And the New Testament says, be careful, those of you who aspire to become teachers, because you will be judged at a greater standard. Oh, now we're back into the judgment thing. Anyway. So Israel has a peculiar identity and story, and I blogged about this, and I wrote about this to CRC Voices, one of my listservs that I participate in. I just don't have as much time for CRC Voices as I did before, now that I'm doing the video, but very indebted to them, that community, for 20 years of great conversation. What then to do with this strange God who got angry at the and the prophets and scribes who attribute the dissolution of the nation to her sin? That doesn't seem to be a wholly different story. A peculiar people are only peculiar if they are in fact peculiar, and Israel is not. And despite the efforts of Elijah and Elisha, never really had much of a taste for it, it seems. If the Lord was putting out for them, they were happy enough with it, but as religious consumers, they were always open for a better deal. Jacques Ellul points out that we imagine the post hoc religious overlay would demand that Israel had good times when those kings had scored a bit better on the Deuteronomist scale, and bad times under the more idolatrous kings, but this seems to be exactly the opposite. Now, if you take a look at Yuval Harari's Sapiens, boy, that was just such a fun book. I enjoyed reading that book. He gets into a lot of these things, and whereas I obviously will differ from Harari on a great many things, he really had a way, he really packaged things in that book in a really cool way in many ways. He asked the question, what is an empire? An empire is a political order with two important characteristics. First, to qualify for that designation, you have to rule over a significant number of distinct peoples. That's what differentiates kingdoms from empires. Kingdoms tend to be these clans or family groups, and they may have one or two other groups that they've assimilated or enslaved or dominated, like the Dutch did to the Frisians. Yes, it's true. But empires are way more. How many people groups? How many people exactly? 2 or 3 is not sufficient. 20 or 30 is plenty. The imperial threshold passes somewhere in between. Second, empires are characterized by flexible borders and potentially unlimited appetite. Assyria decides now it wants to eat Israel and Aram and the old Philistine cities. They can swallow and digest more and more nations and territories without altering their basic structure or identity. And talks about Britain. Now, what then does it take to create an empire? Well, how are empires created? Empires are created by stories. Usually multiple stories, interweaving stories. Money is a story. And here's the thing, bad people make bad subjects. The same reason people make bad slaves. We're too smart, we're too rebellious, we don't like being subjugated or dominated. So many empires use brute force, as Assyria did. Assyria was known for its violence and its brutality, to the degree that an empire could convert itself. Peterson talks about this in terms of Piaget too. I'm trying to do this fast. I didn't have time to pull up the clip, but if you know your Peterson videos, you know he talks about this with respect to Piaget, or either just my mental minions grabbed onto it because they were interested in it. But to the degree an empire could convert itself into a compelling story, it would have to do a lot less overt repression. And I think this is part of the genius of the American empire, because the American empire certainly has subjugated land and peoples, but what it has managed to do is assimilate many, many, many different nations. E pluribus unum, the melting pot. And how does it do it? It does it through story. That's the strongest thing about America, is its story. And part of what people are feeling right now in terms of the instability of America is that the old stories that were felt, that were reinforced in the Cold War, and these stories are no longer holding. And actually, David Brooks talks about this quite eloquently. I've got a video in one of his talks on the NewsHour. He talks about this. America's in story transition right now, and it's one way to understand the political upheaval that's going on. We're in story transition now. Well, this happened after the Cold War too, because at each point in the 20th century when we faced a new challenge, we were at story upheaval. Well, we were in story upheaval during the Depression, and there were many in the United States who were interested in communism, and many who were interested in fascism, and some wanted to preserve democracy. And so every revolution is really story upheaval, and stories dominate us. We live out stories. Our lives are stories. Our nations are stories. Why is this? Probably because the only way we can mentally actually deal with this mysterious world in which we live is by story. And so story colonizes us. Story colonizes everything. Like Jordan Peterson says, stories have us. We don't have stories. We ourselves are stories. This is how this thing mixed together. So if people willingly give themselves to empire, well, all the better. And one way to understand the Bible is to understand Israel's God versus empire. Notice in 2 Kings 17, back to Exodus. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. But what is Egypt? Egypt is the paradigmatic empire. And when you get to the book of Revelation, because those within the Roman Empire don't want to be talking about Rome, so they use code talk. So who do they talk about? They talk about Babylon, and they talk about Egypt. And even though Babylon gets mentioned again and again in the book of Revelation, commentators for a long time have read, there's plenty of Egypt in there. It's all about Exodus, and it's all about dealing with empire. And so the Exodus story is Israel's origin story, and many of us are waiting for November, apparently, for Peterson to start his biblical series again, and I'm certainly very excited about what he's going to do with Exodus. But read Daniel and Ezekiel. This stuff is crystal clear. In the book of Daniel, the Son of Man comes and is given an eternal kingdom, and you have all this imagery in the book of Daniel about it. And if you want to know what this imagery looks like, watch Jonathan Pajot's really cool take on the Robots and Monsters, Pacific Rim. Cool video that Jonathan did on that. But this is all coming from the same place. The sea, the monsters, all that stuff. This is all in the Bible. So Assyria does this mishmash with the people, and the Lord sends in lions. And again, Jordan Peterson people should just be excited when they read this. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, and settled them in the towns of Samaria to replace the Israelites. They took over Samaria and lived in its towns. When they first lived there, they did not worship the Lord. So he sent lions among them, and they killed some of the people. It was reported to the king of Assyria, the people you deported and resettled in the towns of Samaria do not know what the God of the country requires. This is the basic religion, and this is why when the Israelites went up to take the land in the Bible, they listened to all their neighbors and says, yeah, of course, you're not going to do well with that God you met in the desert. That's a desert God. You need a God from here. You need to have the God that's in charge of this. And Baal is essentially just kind of a local mob boss. That's in a sense what Baal is. And so king of Assyria finds some priests from Samaria, sends them down there, and that's going to take care of the lions. But then the text goes on to say basically, well, what do you have? Well, they're then the new people from all these other places, well, they got their little shrine to the Israelite God because, you don't want the lions to get at you, but they got the God that they brought with them, and they got the gods of the other. They got the Baal and some of those gods, and it's the basic polytheistic soup. You keep working with all these little gods, and so, the Lord keeps away the lions, and Baal keeps my wife pregnant, and Asherah keeps my wife pregnant, and Baal keeps the rains coming so that my fields can grow, and this God over here, Molech keeps my kids straight. And this is basically how religious consumerism worked. So what died when the north fell? I think what the book of Kings is saying, not even a story. The story died and was corrupted years before. And so now, on one hand, religions change and change and change and change, and they get corrupted. And, the story of the Protestant Reformation is a story about Martin Luther eventually reformed the church either via the Protestant churches or the Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation, because everybody in the medieval Roman Catholic Church understood that there was horrible corruption and it needed to be fixed. And thanks to the threat of Martin Luther, it did get fixed. But here's the thing. So why do you both have religions that have changeable pieces and religions that have things that stay the same? Well, keeping a canon that you don't change is one attempt to prevent corruption, okay? It's not a guarantee of preventing corruption, but it helps to prevent a corruption. And anybody who deals with texts should understand that, because you don't want to go to 1984 and have, oh, this is the, everyone keep throwing away history. If Sam Harris wants to study Bertrand Russell and someone comes to him and says, oh, we've rewritten Bertrand Russell, here's his book, but I've rewritten it. Sam Harris would say, no, I want to read the book that Bertrand Russell wrote. I want to know the one that he wrote. Well, why? I've improved it. No. How do I know that you've improved it? You probably corrupted it. So what religions manage to do is religions have one piece that stays the same. There's actually your text, that's your canon. And then it has another layer. And in my church life for a number of years, I've been arguing that the church needs to have confessional conversations. And what we're having there is a confessional layer. So in the Christian Reformed Church, you have the Bible, which we don't change, even though we have some would argue, yeah, you should use the King James so it doesn't change. Well, we actually don't use the King James, we use the NIV, and so we actually do keep tinkering with the Bible, and we say we're improving it. You can judge for yourself if that's a good idea. But we're basically trying to have the best text we can and trying to not change that text, and even all of the conversations we're having around the text are an attempt to at least keep the baseline, okay? Because if you don't have a baseline, it's really hard for a community that travels through time to maintain itself, because you don't have a baseline. So the written document becomes a baseline. That becomes your canon. That becomes your text. That becomes your Holy Scripture. Then what you have on top of it, and again, Jews, Muslims, Mormons, almost all religious groups do this, then you have another set of documents on top of it. And this set of documents is potentially changeable, and it's accountable to your canon. So in confessional Reformed Christianity in the Christian Reformed Church, we have the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, and the Canons of Dort. And these are in theory changeable, but they've been getting pretty stiff, because there's real reasons not to change them too quickly. So then the Christian Reformed Church just recently added another level called a contemporary testimony, and those things can be changed, and whether they're ecumenical documents or not. Anyway, that's a whole huge conversation. Well, this is how it works, and so that's why you want something that doesn't change. And if you listen to Rupert Sheldrake, him talking to the people who keep the constants of the universe, well, we're gonna make sure that light stays the same constant, even though when we keep measuring the speed of light, it keeps changing a little bit. But we don't like that. We want it to stay the same. And that's, in fact, how the laws of physics, as Matt Dillahunty talks about them, why they're all looking for that which is basic upon which to build. And again, if you look at Jordan Peterson's Easter videos, what he talks about, there's got to be something at the center. There's got to be a stable ground. And so materialism tends to look at these laws of physics as their canon. That's their stable ground. Well, Christianity, of course, has the Bible, and Muslims have the Quran, and, well, the Book of the Mormon. The Church of Latter-day Saints is very much a prophetic church. They can seem to change a whole lot of things just with new prophets. So religions, Sam Harris's take on religion is just simply not true in terms of the fact that religions don't change. Religions are changing all the time. What religions are an organized conversation to try to manage the reality that you don't understand change if you have nothing that doesn't change. In order to manage change, you must have something that doesn't change. Otherwise, everything is change, and then, quite actually, you probably don't see any change at all, because everything is just consciousness and in the now. So what died when the Northern Kingdom fell? Not even a story. The story died and was corrupted years before. Now, a little bit later, if you keep following my sermons and my rough draft for Sunday, they're going to find the book of the law. They're going to keep finding this book, and then they open it and they're like, we failed. Why? We haven't been looking at it. Why? We didn't have something around that at least didn't change for us. We need that. Otherwise, we can't measure ourselves. We can't orient ourselves in the world if we don't have something that doesn't change. And in fact, if Jordan Peterson were here, he'd say, this is deeply psychological. You need something that doesn't change. And this, in fact, if you listen to his arguments about marriage, this is part of the benefit of marriage, because if you're changing people, if you're changing intimate partners all the time, pretty soon, not even you is you, because they're changing you and you're changing them. What happens in a marriage is that, well, you've limited the number of variables, and, well, Right now, you might think, well, I'd rather be married to this person. But you have no idea what being married to that person would be. So you divorce this one, you go get married to that person, and maybe say it's better or worse, but I've seen plenty of divorces. They're never simple. Okay? How many ways are there to language this? So Ben Shapiro had this way of languaging it, and 2 Kings 17 had its way of languaging it. And does the diversity of language to tell this story mean that the story doesn't exist or doesn't have boundaries or isn't most real if it's acted out? In other words, even though there are many ways to tell a story, it doesn't mean that the story itself doesn't have solidity or reality or ontology of whatever ontology stories have. Israel was always a story. There was some element of ethnicity, but Israel was never just about DNA. And you can find this with a close reading of the book of Exodus. A mixed group comes out of Egypt, and circumcision becomes the sign. And of course, any male with a penis can be circumcised. Non-Israelites could be enfolded. And so Israel was always a story, and I would assert a relationship more than it was just simple ethnicity. But then you have the question, well, why didn't God show up? Why didn't God bail Israel out of her messes? And even though, if you read the book of Kings, you would say that God bailed Israel out plenty. In fact, a lot of the Elijah and Elisha stories are God bailing Israel out in these acts of deliverance. And it's always premised on God remembered David, and God remembered his relationship, and he remembered his commitment. So he said, okay, I will not let them go down in this way. But let's go back to the origin story. God didn't show up at Egypt because the children of Israel had a favor to call in. In fact, they had even forgotten his name. And part of the reason that story is told that way is, I think, to emphasize the fact that God is the initiator. God is the instigator. God is where the story starts. The story doesn't start with us. And this is how the consumerist story starts. The consumerist story always has myself in the middle and myself at the center, and then this is moralistic therapeutic deism, and then God is an asset I employ in order to shape the story as I want it. But again, if you go back to my conversation with Nathan, it's not so easy to know how I want my story to be, partly because with not too much self-reflection, I'll realize that what I want changes from day to day, and what I want is constructed in the world around me. So if I'm living in a house full of car nuts, I want a nice car. And if I'm living in a house full of computer gamers, I want a great gaming rig. And if I live in a house full of sex addicts, I want sex. And people are like this. And so implicitly, when we place ourselves at the center of the story, what we imagine is that we are the foundation. And that's part of my criticism about the idea of coming at us through consciousness. That's the undeniable. That's the starting space. And Sam Harris kind of undermines that with his consciousness being dependent on the brain. But I'm a very short-lived, fickle creature that, okay, what I want is going to be my guide. Well, again, as Nathan said quite clearly, one of my big challenges are my wants. I keep my eye on the time. My wants get me into trouble. And read Augustine. The guy who was sleeping against my door here, his wants are his master. And it's making a disaster of his life. Is that good? Is that bad? How can you tell? He thought it was good. There was one time where the weather would get bad. He'd get himself into the mental hospital he'd always be careful not to be there too long to jeopardize him getting his check from Social Security. And so I remember one time he came out of the hospital and I could tell he had the correct psych meds dialed in. He had all the other drugs out of his system. He was looking healthy. A bunch of the sores he had on his feet were healed. And he was decently dressed and he was clean. And he comes up to me and I look him in the eye and his eyes are clear. And I'm like, all right, What are you going to do with your life? You've got a clean head right now. You're in your right mind. What choice are you going to make? And I came back later that evening, and there was a mattress that he had found somewhere, dragged over back behind the parking lot at church, and he had a joint in one hand and a beer in the other, and he came up to me and he bragged about the crack whore he had in the mattress, ready to do her. And it's like, here we are. Here we are. I'm going to base reality on me. None of us would agree to having reality based on any other person around us. What will I base reality on? Well, here's the thing about God. You get rid of him, suddenly you have a problem of what to do instead of him. It'd be like getting rid of dark matter out of your equations of the universe. Well, suddenly your equations don't work. Israel is built on the initiative of God, not her ability to maintain her side of the relationship. And this is where all of this talk about divine election comes from. And divine election doesn't just show up in the New Testament. What you find in the New Testament has its roots in the Old. God elects Israel. And the Old Testament talks about this all the time. God saying to Israel through the prophets, I didn't choose you because you were the first of the nations. I didn't choose you because you were the greatest of the nations. I didn't choose you for any of those reasons. And in fact, there's this amazing story in the book of Ezekiel where God tells his story with Israel about finding a baby that was kicking in the blood and the mud. It was like an infant abandoned in the mud, and God takes this little girl in and raises her and makes her his queen. You can maybe find that in my many videos on the book of Ezekiel that are on my church site. But now we get back to the strange tension, and this is Jordan Peterson talking to my friend, where, okay, well, if God is choosing, does that then destroy free will? Does that then destroy our agency? And this is where, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately with all the thinking I've been doing on Sam Harris, this is where there's a certain alignment or a certain resemblance between some of this materialism and Calvinism, that there is a recognition in both philosophical systems of how deeply constructed we are, and that why are you a Christian Reformed pastor, Paul? Because your father was, and because your grandfather was. Well, why did you maintain your religion and many other people have gotten rid of it? Well, because my parents were wonderful parents, and maybe my temperament is such that I'm temperamentally conservative, because in some ways I am, even though I'm politically not that conservative. Temperamentally, I'm conservative. Growing up, my mother would make my lunch, and I would eat the same thing for lunch every day. My mother would say, don't you want a different sandwich? I said, no, same sandwich. I like eating the same thing every day. Maybe that makes me autistic. I don't know. But why am I who I am? Well, my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. I'm the sum of all of that. Well, then you get into Jordan Peterson land, and I'm all of this stuff from thousands or millions of years, and it's all been built into me from the bottom up, and the identical twins studies and the separation, and I am a deeply constructed person. And part of what science and the materialists, what that vision of the world emphasizes is that we are deeply constructed, that if I had been robbed from the hospital at birth and raised by a different family, an abusive family, I probably wouldn't be here telling these stories or doing this in this way. Maybe in some other ways I would, but how do we know? How could we know? We know history is like this. We know reality is like this. So that's why science works. That's why technology works. But is that actually sufficient to account for who we are? And to me, the answer is clearly no. There's way more to us. And so then, again, Peterson comes down to it and says, okay, now I'm working on the God stuff. And what impressed me, and I talked about this in the little video that I did with Matt, that if I post that. I'll put that little video before. Maybe I should just post that little video anyway, just ahead of time. But if Peterson was amazing in that video because, again, this is what strikes me about this guy. How well he worked that crowd of 160 people at the VIP event, listening to them. But also, when he was listening to my friend Matt, Peterson at this point is at no place in the hierarchy where he needs to deal with Paul Vanderklay or my friend or any of us nobodies. He's got the attention of the mass media. He's got money from his book sales and his book tour. He doesn't have to deal with someone like me. And some of you out there will say, Paul, you should talk to Sam Harris. Sam Harris isn't going to talk to me. Why isn't Sam Harris going to talk to me? Because there's nothing in it for him. Because I don't have anything to offer him. And we see obstacles and obstructions. And so, you know, who's in charge of Vox? I mean, Sam Harris will have a debate with him because they're at the same status-wise. I mean, you've got your intellectual dark web. Those people aren't going to pay any attention to me. I'm a nobody. And I am a nobody. I really am. And I know some of you write me and say, no, you're not a nobody. I really am. I'm a nobody. But Peterson listened to this guy's take on Christianity, and Peterson asked him questions. And you could tell by his voice that he was sincere. And this is something alarmingly refreshing in our world, where someone of high status would, now I'm going to use theological language, condescend to listen to a low status person. You know what? We use that language when Christians talk about prayer, because there's nobody higher status than God. And so part of, I think, the offensiveness of the idea that God listens and answers prayer is that he busts the hierarchy when he does it. That the God of the universe would care about me. And actually, Matt talks about that in my conversation with Matt a lot. That was a central thing to his conversion, that someone of such high status would care about me. And I talk about that with Matt. So at some point, my video with Matt will be seen. And if Matt decides to never post the Peterson video, that's up to Matt. But my video with Matt, I'll show that at some point. So how could the disobedience of the people, the people bring Israel's destruction, but her obedience not guarantee it? And I think this is what's right at the heart of this problem, because this is the piece of logic that we bank on. If Israel's disobedience brought her destruction, it is implied that our obedience can guarantee our salvation. And that I do not believe is true. And I don't think it's true of natural law. And we see this all the time. I go to the doctor and say, Doctor, I haven't smoked. Oh, but I can still be hit by a car. What it shows is that who we are and what we are. Could the disobedience of the people bring Israel's destruction, but her obedience not guarantee it? Yes. Can empire beat obedience? Is the prophetic, or are the scribes of the book of Kings saying that if Israel had complied with the covenant, then Israel would have shined like the sun and stood above the nations, as the prophets so often imagined? Could Israel have fulfilled her end of the deal? That's exactly the question that troubles us. Because if we say Israel couldn't, then it's unfair or unreasonable for God to hold her accountable. But if Israel could, well, then God is able to punish her. But this is always the question with how many different things in life. Questions with alcoholics and people who are messing up. Because we look at an alcoholic and we say, you could stay sober if you wanted to. Really? Do we know that? And if you've dealt with enough alcoholics, you know to have a little bit of humility about that question. Once that question is posed, your glance should go directly to Jesus. Why? Well, this is how Jesus answers the questions of the Old Testament. Because Jesus was faithful Israel. That's how he's portrayed in the New Testament. He's faithful Israel, and, shouldn't say she, oops, and he too was dismantled by empire of the day. He was spread naked on a cross for the political sport and mockery, even though he, unlike Israel, had fulfilled the covenant. Here's how the New Testament sets it up. And this is set up by the book of Job, and it's set up by how many different places in the Old Testament. Boy, my software is running terribly today. I hope my video is in better shape than this, but you know, the sound recording I hope should be good. The idea of karma and of religion is this. If I obey and comply, then I will be blessed. And if it's just a this age religion, I'll be blessed in this age. Then it's My Name is Earl, a TV show that was on a few years ago. Do good and you'll receive good. Well, we very quickly learn in this world that that's not true. Okay. Well, adding God, if you add God to it, does that make it true? Well, there's the question. The book of Job suggests no. So then you run a thought experiment. What if someone fully complied with the law? What if someone lived a perfect life? Well, this is exactly how the New Testament and the church sets this up, because it said, well, we can't really answer the question about Israel if Israel had fully complied and fulfilled the law, if she, in fact, would have become the center of one world kingdom and all the nations would have flocked to her, and the earth had been filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea, so says the prophets. But what if one man were perfect? What if one man did everything right? What if one man could answer all of the questions correctly and in fact live correctly, could not only speak with authority but live perfectly? Wouldn't that man then go up to the top of the hierarchies and rule the world from Jerusalem? Wouldn't Israel be fulfilled? In a sense, that's what Israel is looking for and waiting for. And the answer of the New Testament and of Jesus is no. Why? Look what happens to him. In a vicious culture war where Romans and Zealots and Essenes and Pharisees and Herodians could not agree on anything, the one thing they could agree on was that the world would be better without Jesus. And that should temper all of the ideas that Jesus is some real nice guy that we would instantly love, whether you're a Christian or whatever kind of person you are. No. People found Jesus deeply disturbing and troubling and attractive. All of that at the same time. And I've brought up Tim Keller's great appropriation of Jonathan Edwards' observation of the discordant excellencies that Jesus was. He was attractive and he was repulsive. He fascinated and he horrified. And this is why he caused so much dissonance among people they decided to kill him. That's what Jesus was. Now, he was also perfect. And if you think about what perfection would be, that's how we would respond to perfection. Part of us, the better parts of us, would be attracted to him, and the more imperfect parts of us would be repulsed by him. And so even Peter, his number one disciple, when Jesus lays his plans out in front of Peter, Peter says, I'm not going to let that happen. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Well, why is this playing out this way? Well, this is exactly what you would expect from a perfect person in an imperfect world. If you found perfection, you would both lust after it and want to get rid of it because it would destroy your life. And this is the story of Jesus. So the question is, can empire beat obedience? Perfect obedience will be destroyed in this world. But really? So if disobedience yields dissolution, Israel pre-dissolved its identity even before Assyria just made it obvious by moving the flags. And again, you can see this all the time. Organizations are corrupt and fail from within, And finally, the outer edifice collapses. We saw that with the Soviet Union. We're probably seeing it with North Korea. You see it all the time. Institutions arise. If they corrupt, they break apart from the inside out, and it falls in. And this is what happens all the time with human hierarchies. Why doesn't obedience secure the kinds of blessings our religious consumerist hearts long for? Doesn't that seem fair? And this, in fact, is something that people implicitly or explicitly bring to me as a pastor. They say, Pastor, I am going to church, I am tithing, I am not having sex with my girlfriend, or I am being faithful to my wife, or I am being a good wife, and I am submitting to whomever you say I should submit to, and I am holding authority over whoever you say I'm supposed to have authority over. I am obeying all the rules. Why isn't my life working? And I have to say, are you more perfect than Jesus? And anyone that's been catechized in the church will say no. And then I'd say, if you look at Jesus' life, does perfection get you this imagined good life that you think you want? What did it get Jesus? In fact, the better you are, the more you will be attacked. Well, can we triumph? Can we crack the code? Let's take God out of the picture again. And let's just have natural law. And can we, if we crack the code of natural law, can we fulfill it? Think about how many times you heard Jordan Peterson talk about Dostoevsky's piano keys. He quotes this at length in Maps of Meaning. And I'll quote it myself at a little bit more length. Now I ask you, this is Dostoevsky from Notes from Underground. Now I ask you, what can be expected of man since he is a being endowed with strange qualities? Shower upon him every earthly blessing. Drown him in a sea of happiness, so that nothing but bubbles of bliss can be seen on the surface. Give him economic prosperity, such that he should have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of his species. That sounds like someone who needs to read 12 Rules for Life because he's in his mother's basement, eating Cheetos, playing video games, looking at porn. Not even propagating his species, but just, I won't go there. And even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick. He would even risk his cakes and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive good sense his fatal, fantastic element. This is who we are. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were so necessary, that men are still men and not the keys of a piano, which the laws of nature threaten to control so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but the calendar. And this in Jordan Peterson 2015 Maps of Meaning ascribes to the celebrity atheists. And that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even if this were proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even if Sam Harris had his way with him, fully with his rational mind, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposely do something perverse out of simple ingratitude simply to gain his point. And if he does not find means, he will contrive destruction and chaos, will contrive suffering of all sorts, only to gain his point. He will launch a curse upon the world, and as only man can curse, it is his privilege, the primary distinction between him and other animals. Maybe by his curse alone he will attain his object, that is, convince himself that he is a man and not a piano key. If you say that is all, this too can be calculated and tabulated, chaos and darkness and curses, so that the mere possibility of calculating it all before would stop it all, and reason would reassert itself, then man would purposely go mad in order to be rid of reason and gain his point. You'd almost think Dostoevsky's sitting down with Matt Dillahunty or Sam Harris at this point. I believe in it. I answer for it. For the whole work of man seems to consist in nothing but proving to himself every minute that he is a man and not a piano key. It may be at the cost of his skin, it may be by cannibalism. And this being so, can one help being tempted to rejoice that it has not yet come off, and that desire still depends on something we don't know? Yeah, Dostoevsky. He's brutal. Okay, little self-important center of the universe, what independent, unconstructed, self-existent platform will you stand upon to put God in your debt? Read the end of the book of Job. How will you stand and say, I can save myself? When my sister was a little girl, she was angry with my mother and decided she was going to run away from home. And so she announced to my mother, she's running away from home. And my mother said, fine, but you have to leave everything I've given you. What do you mean? No clothes, no toys. She was probably 6 years old. You're a 6-year-old girl. What have you done? What have you done that you cannot credit your parents for? What have you done that you cannot credit your culture for? What have you done that you cannot credit your religion for? What have you done that you cannot point to someone else and say, I am the heir of this long list of things? If you're an evolutionist, a lobster. What have you done? This mind that you have, the education you received, the DNA that you inherited from countless generations, the likes of which you don't know. You do a spit test just to get a little percentage of maybe who they were on some scale or another. We are all heirs of this incredible line, yet we stand up and say, me, I will do it. Your story is another continuation of this much larger story, and if it weren't for that entire story, you wouldn't exist. Everything you have, even yourself, your DNA, your story, your identity, came from God. Well, no, it didn't come from God. I don't believe in God. Where did it come from? Came from the universe. You got Verizon Lisa there. Came from the universe. You didn't make you. You can't construct you. If any group should know this, it's the materialists. They're the ones that are beyond a doubt, should be aware that they can't attribute to themselves this great insight of rationality and the promise that it holds for the world. None of us can on any score. We are all heirs of our past. Is that all we are? Now, I would say no. They would have to say yes. So how on earth can they imagine themselves by their own rationality to self-create this world? What could you possibly give a being that literally owns everything? Can we save ourselves? We can't even establish ourselves. We can't even credit ourselves. And now you're saying, oh, but are you saying we can't between ourselves credit us things? When we do so, we always assume a certain pattern. Let's say LeBron James is a great basketball player. He is. Should we credit his mom? Yeah. Did LeBron James add to it? Yeah. What is that thing that he added? We really can't say. We don't know. What's the difference between LeBron James and some other great person? We don't know. We just don't know. Why are we so scared to admit that? Well, I think it's scarier to admit that in a universe without God than it is to admit it in a universe with God. So then we find other gods, and this is what we do. You can't save yourself from much of anything, much less everything, without employing that which you haven't borrowed or stolen or been given by birth. It's preposterous. You can't save yourself. Your smarts, your character, your education, the matrix of morality you judge the world through are inherited. Materialists should admit this more than anyone because they say it's all inherited, launched by the Big Bang. Give me one miracle and I'll explain the rest, baby. If you watch any of my sermons, you know I always use the Heidelberg Catechism. Why? because it helps me structure this reality. The Heidelberg Catechism is structured: misery, deliverance, gratitude. Misery, I'm fallen and I can't get up. Often my attempts make things worse. Deliverance, out of no obligation, God gives grace. God saved Israel out of Egypt because he chose to. Simple. Your obedience can't affect your deliverance. Gratitude. Now I need to get to work with everything that's available to me. I respond to God's grace. That's the Christian life. That's human life. That's the good. Because I've been given something, I say, I'm going to use what I've been given, and I'm going to respond in gratitude. I am going to do just like my hero has done for me. Watch Saving Private Ryan. Earn it. What did that mean? It meant that Tom Hanks and his little crew gave their lives to find Private Ryan. What does that do for Private Ryan? It made him the man he is. Now, can we do all the math on this? No. Can you throw questions at me about this I can't answer? Yes. But I think this is the outline. This is the best outline I've been able to come up with. Heidelberg Catechism locates the Ten Commandments not under deliverance. In misery, it says we can't keep the law, but under gratitude. My accomplishments aren't from a clean room. I am no clean room. I'm the heir of all these past generations. I borrow the stuff of God to work in the world he made. It's a stewardship. I don't own anything. Naked I came into the world. Naked I'm going out of it. Well, I hope they put a suit on me. But this is how it is. I'm a story. What can a story grab? How can a story fill a suitcase? My stuff of my body is from God. It's borrowed. I'm stewards of it. And God says, here, have this stuff. Use it. Play with it. I want to see what you can do with it. Please do something great. And God all the time is, just like we look at our kids. You give your kids something and they mess around and they make a mistake and they do stuff. And see, I don't think it gets rid of agency. But we are just not sufficient creatures to take credit for something as large as the salvation of our story. And it's more than just from above. And so the deeply religious argument is that God tells us to do it. Yeah. The deeper religious argument is that we can't. So what is God going to do when we can't do it? Now, yes, all kinds of questions come in. Well, why me and why not me? And so with Nathan, that's where we went with my conversation with Nathan too. Why does he get it and he doesn't get it? Why can this person go to AA and get it and start leading a sober, sane life, and this other person's been through rehab 8 times? Is it biology? Maybe. Is it the circumstances of their family life? Maybe. We don't know. Are all those factors? Yes. Remember, reality, the more real, the more all the layers. That's why acting is more real than just talking. That's why I can say the good better than I can act the good. And that just gives us a sense of what limited agents we are and how small and powerless we are, which is why it brings such tremendous comfort that despite the mess I can make of my life, the shortcomings I have, that it is not a matter of qualifying. It is finished. It is done for us. Because if I have to do it for myself, I can't get there. And I think that's the best answer. Because even the good that I do, this is what the Heidelberg Catechism says. I was trained in the Catechism at my youth. I'm just fulfilling my program. And I know there's always some commenters that say, your church and your parents really messed you up. I'm a happy mess, my friend. Even the good that I do is dependent on what he gives me. Go ahead and build a house. without the materials of this earth that do not come from you. Go ahead and think with the gray matter that you cannot take credit for. You did not build your brain. Well, but I ate and I exercised and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, genetics had a whole lot to do with it. We all know that. It isn't just compliance. Compliance alone can never finally get there. That's why it's grace. I think that's my last slide. The computer's not really working well today. Yes, it is my last slide. So I was reading a thing on how to be a better YouTuber, and there's all these things I'm supposed to do that I'm not doing, and maybe I'll do them sometime, but it's just little me in my office in my tiny little church. So just a little program note. Rebel Wisdom was here on Sunday. It is just delightful. This is what I mean by you can't take credit for things. But the turn of events in my life over since last December when I started making videos is absolutely inconceivable. That, these guys from the UK would come and spend a day at Livingstone's, and my congregation, boy, the shock on their eyes, like, who are these people? What are they doing? And, they don't watch my YouTubes. They're like, what are you doing on YouTube that these people would come and do this? And when these happy things happen, I just think, God is good. God is good. And what God will do with any of this, I have no idea. But another thing that I wanted to pick up was on the Rubin Report episode with Jordan Peterson and Eric Weinstein. I've got to find it again because I watch things and my minions store it away for later. Then I got to find the dumb thing again. Weinstein at some point makes an argument that the reason the intellectual dark web can merrily proceed is that there's a level of trust that things will be okay. There's a religious move. Because isn't that what religion does? All these stories that Sam Harris complains about? Heidelberg Catechism, first question and answer. What is my only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ, who was fully paid for all my sins by his precious blood, and has saved me from the tyranny of the devil. He watches over me in such a way that not a hair can fall from my head without the will of my Father in heaven. In fact, all things must work out for my good. Believing that is often aspirational. But if you can believe it, even in suffering. And again, I think this is something that Peterson gets deeply right. We need meaning to deal with the inevitable suffering of this world. If even the world's most perfect man would be killed by empire, handed over by his own people, when he hadn't done anything deserving death, and everybody agrees on that. Well, that's the kind of world we live in. So, how do you want to live? How can you actually have joy in this world? And I would argue, even the best things are yet to come. As I told my friend Nathan, why not believe this story? This story is just simply too good not to see your story inside of it. There's a good ending.